Faster Than Light Radio Show.
Hi and welcome once again to the show. Thanks for joining us. It's good to be back in real time, giving you news and information about science fiction and fantasy available for your eyes, for your minds here in Western Australia. The last 2 weeks, I trust you've enjoyed those reprises really from the end of last year, as we did an instant replay on Filk Singing with Dave Luckett. And thanks again to Dave and Sully for loaning us their collection, and for Dave for being such a wonderful person to interview. By now, many of you will have had the chance to have met Dave at SwanCon 13 and to realise what good interests he has for fandom in general. I missed the Guest of Honour speech in which both Guests of Honour, Dave Luckett and Tim Richards, spoke on the Sunday evening, and I'm sorry to have done so. I must try and get hold of some tape copy and feed that into the program over the next couple of months. From what I heard that was said, both of the Guests of Honour were about attempting to break down the barriers that sometimes divide fans up into little kingdoms of their own. Media fans different from science fiction fans, Trek fans different from Doctor Who fans, etc., and create a generally wide acceptance in the atmosphere of fandom that allows every person to enjoy their own thing and at the same time gives other people the freedom to enjoy what they like. Well, more of that. That's really what the Faster Than Light radio show's on about. We seem to talk about anything and everything and are quite willing to talk to anyone and everyone. The amount of publicity campaigns that are happening at the moment in publishing mean that over the next month there is a good chance that you will hear on this radio show the voice of J.G. Ballard, I'll tell you why in a minute, the voice of Clive Barker, and a very interesting female writer from New Zealand who may not be in your area of reading interest at the moment, and I trust it's not too long before she is, Margaret Mahy. Margaret, I think, is the first voice you're likely to hear. She's coming to Australia for the Adelaide Writers' Week, and I'll be interviewing her by phone in Melbourne. The other two, of course, are not coming to Australia either. J.G. Ballard's being made available thanks to his publishing company in London. Due for release is the paperback of Empire of the Sun, and that's due to coincide with the release next month in Australia of the film of the same name, Steven Spielberg having put that together as an American-Chinese co-production. And I'm looking forward to seeing the movie, talking to J.G. Ballard about the work and about his writing in general. As for Clive Barker, well, that's another major Collins release this year. It's coming out next month, I believe, in hardcover. Weave World. And Weave World is the horror writer par excellence, the enfant terrible of the tradition of British horror writing, as Clive Barker has been touted. It's his entree into science fiction, and it looks to be a very good read indeed. It's certainly large enough for all of those of you who are Stephen King fans and like a large read. Clive Barker's Weave World is on the list of heavy books for the year. In fact, there's more I want to tell you about. I'll be back in a moment.
Paperback Writers.
One of the good paperbacks that's coming out this month is the paperback edition of Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Earth. We talked a little bit about this book in its hardcover edition about 12-14 months ago now on the show. I'm looking forward to doing a full program on Foundation and Earth sometime within the next 3 weeks. It's a huge work, and I think it's one of the better Asimov books of recent years. I said it about Foundation's Edge that I thought Isaac Asimov was writing much better than when he first attempted the project of looking into future history, as he did for the original Foundation trilogy. Foundation and Earth, from all bits of reading that I've done and from everything I've heard from those that have read the full amount, is, well, it's top of the drawer stuff, and it's certainly a book that I think will have a wide readership in paperback. It's been available in one form or another around town for some time. I trust that when this month Foundation and Earth comes out with a vengeance, that there's still going to be a large audience out there. I believe there will be. More about that on a future program. Also, I wanted to make some mention of the state of 1987 paperback publishing in the US. It's pretty traditional for Locus, the newspaper of the science fiction field, to in either the January or the February issue to cast a backward glance over the year that's gone before and give us some information on the nature of science fiction publishing. Well, the February issue of Locus, which has just come to hand, that's the February 88 issue, has the 1987 book summary in it. And there's some interesting facts here. All told, in the United States, States there were 1,675 books that are regarded as genre books, science fiction publishing in the US. This is up 12% on last year, and what's even more interesting is all of this gain is made in original new books. They're up some 21%. They account for a huge, and I found this quite amazing, 1,026 works in the genre field, and that takes in fantasy, horror, anthologies, collections, etc., etc. But over 1,000 works in the field. It's the best material we've had in years, at least it's the best numbers we've had in years within the science fiction field. I enjoy looking at these figures, again, for what they show me about what the trend is within the marketplace. The last time we had a really bumper crop of science fiction was back in the late 70s, just after the release of Star Wars. And these days, at 1,600 books, we are some 400 works in front of the figures achieved in the late 1970s. This was said to be the latter golden age of science fiction. So what are we into now? It certainly would seem to me to be a new heyday, and the genre is certainly selling very well and selling in abundance. Specialty stores around the world, including Perth, Western Australia, would attest to the fact that there's a generally large readership for science fiction and fantasy. But it's the breakdown of the figures within the genre that is even more interesting, because when you look at the new titles, the real spurt of growth in new titles has been in the fantasy horror genre rather than in science fiction. I know one of the panels debating at SwanCon 13 was whether or not fantasy is killing science fiction. Well, I don't think it kills it. I think neither of them are mutually exclusive, and I think in one sense having a strong version of either fantasy, horror or science fiction on the newsstands makes way for the other to have some space on the newsstands and finds a readership. Much of the readership, I believe, crosses over. Mind you, these are debating points and they're worth taking up. But it's interesting to note that in 1987, fantasy and horror books finally outstripped science fiction books originally within the mass market, trade list and hardcover lists in the US. Fantasy and horror are accounting for some 500 new works, and science fiction is accounting for a shade less in the 400s. Very interesting. Well, I told you there were some interesting figures in Locus. If you want the full breakdown, you can find them in the February 88 issue. There is much, much more. One of the other interesting facts, and I'll just mention it in closing, was that there are 177 publishers in the US publishing science fiction genre material in 1987. You say, but what about Britain? Because that's the area of the world that we hear from. My experience has been over the last decade that the size of the British audience and publishing audience for science fiction and fantasy is about 2/3 that of the American audience, which means that there must have been somewhere in the region of 1,000 works published, including reprints, in the UK within the genre in 1987. This would hold about true with the sort of reviewing material that I've seen. I think there would have been upwards of 600 to 700 paperbacks that passed before my eyes last year. It's an amazing amount of material, and obviously not one that we can cover easily on just one radio show. Interesting that next week, as we look at some of this newer work that's appearing before us, I also thought we might take a look at a new book that's come out from Dent. Not a lot to do with the genre field, but it's called Rotten Reviews, a literary companion. But that's for next week's program. And a look in a completely different direction before we head on to the topic of SwanCon 13. For the remainder of the program, I thought I should bring to your attention the fact that this week, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, there are horror classics late on in the evening on ABC at Channel 2. It's interesting that the ABC is seeking to repeat some material that it used only last year, some of the 1940s classics such as The Curse of the Cat People. That's on Thursday night. But The Body Snatchers, the 1945 version, is on Wednesday night, and I noticed that on Friday night the movie that they're deciding to run is I Walked with a Zombie from 1943. So if you've never seen any of these classics of the field in black and white, your own television set can deliver them without ads, courtesy of ABC. In fact, there's not a lot on offer for genre people to be watching on the television set at the moment, although I did notice as I was leaving home this morning, this is Monday as we record, that Thunderbirds 2068, was on the television set. Japanese animation, 8:30 in the morning. I think it was Channel 7. Well worth taking a look at. Certainly some quality material and the sort of stuff that I more associate with the ABC around about the 5 o'clock in the evening children's programming, rather than Channel 7. If you've not seen the Japanese version of Thunderbirds, and I must dig around and find out some of its history, it's screening at the moment here in Perth. Well, let's take a break. When we return, we're coming to look at SwanCon 13 and the panel that this radio show produced there.
Supernova Books, 135 William Street, near Wellington Street, have a wide range of science fiction and fantasy books. Fantasy art also available. Program sponsor Supernova Books, open every day, including Thursday night, all day Saturday, and from 12 noon Sunday.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Faster Than Light radio show. If my voice is unfamiliar to you, that's because I'm unfamiliar to you. My name is Harry Harrison. I'm a science fiction writer.
Indeed, Harry is, and this is a science fiction and fantasy radio show. Talking of news about town, I should make mention that Supernova changed hands in January, and the new owner is behind the counter. You ought to make yourself known to him. Alwyn Unwin is his name, and he's looking forward to meeting many of the listeners to this show and making good customers of them, I'm sure. No free plugs, as they say. Going on to look at SwanCon 13, it's interesting that over the convention in a bicentennial year, I decided that what we might do for SwanCon 13 was do a panel which was a mixture between oral history and oral history, that we, as all the fans, the local community of fans was gathered together in the Westos Motor Inn, it might be a useful idea to get them to talk out some of their roles as they perceived and remembered them within the science fiction history of the WA community. So we started off with a version of, if you might like, Radio Price is Right, where I called particular people, notables from the audience, down to talk about various aspects of history, and I designed a timeline in which we could fiddle this together. We started off by talking about AussieCon 1, which was the genesis of what was to become the Perth fan community. We talked also about SwanCon 1, and this material I've edited off the front end of the tape. We take up the story where I started to think about what happened after SwanCon 1. The Fanish record, this is another thing I want to say and wanted to make evident. The Fanish record that exists is up here in our minds and in these things. And fanzine editors control our history. And what you leave behind in the fanzines is largely what we get to know of what happened in Western Australia, unless there's someone else comes along to dispute it. For instance, the largest report on SwanCon 1 was written up by Robert McGough, who didn't have anything to do with the organisation, still a very good friend of mine, even though I would quibble with some of the facts in the way in which he wrote up the convention. But he wrote it from a participant's point of view. Were you at the first one, Larry?
Yes.
Larry Dunning, come on down! Step closer, Larry. So tell us, what was the feeling of SwanCon 1 from a participant? How did you end up there?
Well, that was a story unto itself, because I was actually playing in postal games at the time, and the first thing I found out about SwanCon 1 was from someone in Sydney, a friend of mine, and a letter appears and there is going to be SwanCon 1 over in WA. I thought, how does he know this? So I phoned up Stephen Gunnell, who lived not far away from me. He said, there's something going to be very strange and weird going to be happening over here. I wasn't wrong, but it was great, it was fun. It was something that was so new. It was the first convention I've ever been to, it's the first Fanish event I've ever been to, and I've been in fandom ever since. And it was unusual because you had a group of people together for the first time in WA, and it's been a tradition ever since, hasn't it?
It has. Tell us about the ducks.
The ducks. Well, Tony happens to have, or he did have many years ago, these ducks out in the backyard. I remember that.
Since been eaten.
I dare say. And actually, these ducks, I remember talking to Tony many years ago, and there was someone else who I recall, Mitch, Short Mitch, he was from the Wargaming group, and we were talking about these ducks walking down. And I remember Tony writing an article about ants in the garden too, that was in Reflections.
In Reflections?
Yes.
It was. The ducks had ducklings during the convention.
That's right.
You must have drunk well in the evening to have forgotten
That's right. And hence SwanCon.
Hence SwanCon.
Or a true SwanCon.
No, we'd had the name before SwanCon, but I think the ducks sealed it as a metaphor. We never quite achieved the largeness and brilliance of swans, but we had sort of short, fat, squattish things that looked slightly ugly, but they were enjoyable and cuddly. Yeah, waterfowl of a different sort. So, Larry, did that inspire you to start a fanzine?
Not straight away, because I was already printing one. And it wasn't a SF fandom, it was a games fanzine. Much later I started the Phantom Zine, which was a WA Yapper. That lasted just over a year. Later on I started my own proper fanzine, which I'm still doing. The penultimate issue just came out.
The penultimate issue?
Yes, the ultimate issue comes out next time.
It's going to die.
Yes, but, well, actually, it's going to be transmogrified into something else.
Good-o. Keeps librarians happy, they just change their titles all the time. Thanks, Larry. Now, SwanCon 1 was interesting in itself because there were a group of people that came together. They enjoyed the convention so much that they decided to form a club. Now, I say this advisedly because there was already a component of the SwanCon 1 membership who were in a club. There was a wargaming club existing, and they had rooms. Now, I wasn't actually party to the history of the early shifting of what became known as WASFA, the West Australian Science Fiction Association, in its sort of very formative months, but it ended up in a house alongside a tip. Now, I mean, this is the perfect place for a fanish sort of, it wasn't a slan shack because no one actually lived there. It was sort of just, did they? What? People know more about it than I do. Who can remember the Hertha Road house? Good on you, Bobo. Bobo Ogden, come on down. So tell us about this house.
It was actually rented by the Wargaming Society that was, as you were saying, the membership was part of WASFA and the West Australian Historical Wargamers, and was more used for the wargaming. That was a very much regular event.
Right.
However, the science fiction group, I think, really got their energy for the first few years from the fact that they had this really marvellous location. I mean, the aroma of the place was indescribable.
Fanzines loved it.
Yeah. There was a very great amount of socialising going on at this venue. As I was saying, Rob McGough was actually living there for a time, although he did leave for Sydney later, which meant that if you wanted, you could just drop in any old time and sort of talk about books, talk about fanzines, although fanzines weren't a real
part of the community.
Part of the community at that stage. It was a slight involvement through some of the Eastern States ones, but nothing being published. I think the first fanzine I ever saw published was Felder.
Right.
Which was at that venue,
right.
But not followed up very much at all.
Right. Can you remember anything else about those early WASFA days, Bob?
Well, the original meeting location was in Subiaco at Keatley Road.
Right.
Once again, that was the wireless location. After we went from Hertha Road, I think we met at, I think it's called Wesley House in Perth for a while. Then, yeah, it's actually called Wesley House. It's just occupied by BP.
Who was the first president of WASFA? It was Laurie, wasn't it?
Yes.
And Zig was the second?
I think I was the second.
You were the second. We're getting to you, Sally. I knew you were early on in these days.
Yeah, Zig I think was secretary treasurer for most
under
of
Laurie's period.
Yeah, for most of that period.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
The memory clouds. I have fond memories of the Hertha Road house too. It was sort of the place you could scream up to in the middle of the night, jump off your motorbike, grab a book, eat something, drink something, talk to a few people and leave again. It's a sort of, meetings were amorphous to say the least. And as the wargamers were always sort of hunched over boards and mumbling to themselves, it didn't really matter when you came and left because they didn't notice you'd been. The sense of WASFA developing its own history though, happened during those years, and it largely hung around the idea that they wanted to keep SwanCons going as well as have a regular meeting. So we developed this sort of strange bipartisan structure within WA fandom. There were a group of people who wanted to keep the SwanCons going and a group of people who wanted to meet regularly. And ever since that time there's been some tension because they don't exactly share the same ideas, and the same sense of energy is not needed to do both things. At the moment you've got the Cappuccino Bar on a Thursday. When is it meeting? First Thursday in the month. The Cappuccino Bar being the place where they're meeting. This is also a sort of Fanish tradition almost. Name a place and just get there and have a conversation. You've also got the FM meetings happening on a regular basis.
First Saturday every month?
Second Saturday of the month. And they're both regular events so that people can socialise, and SwanCons continue on. There are other clubs now in place, and I don't really know their history. The more specific clubs, the clubs that are formed around either one media or another, that's interesting in its own right, or around places like the University of Western Australia and now more recently Curtin. Really surprisingly, because Murdoch has this huge collection of science fiction and all these millions of fanzines, there's never been a science fiction group at Murdoch. I've tried 3 or 4 times to get off the ground SF Romu, but it's never happened, so it's existed in sort of limbo as an organisation waiting to happen. So more of you join Murdoch and it could happen. Yes, it may change. Anthony's just enrolled at Murdoch. Hallelujah. Well, let's get back to the history. WASFA existed in this place, and Laurie was its first president, and he was a public servant, and Ziggy was working in telecom, and I was still at Murdoch, was at Murdoch and living at St Columba, and we had between us a lot of material that we could pull on and pull together. That's machinery and such like. And we edited down the results of the writing workshop at SwanCon 1 and published it as signatures. Signet, you see, swans, baby swans, the products of the... It was my idea of a pun. I love it. It's great. But WASFA decided it needed its own material, its own magazine. It didn't happen in Laurie's time, but it happened under the second regime. And Sally Beasley, as it is now, come on down. What's your remembrance of WASFA at this stage, Sally? Has it got better over the years?
Well, WASFA's defunct now, so it hardly got better over the years. I emigrated from England in 1977 with one name in Western Australia given me by Chris Priest. I'd been in fandom in Britain for about 6 years. And the one name was Maureen Smith. And on a very hot February day, about a week after I had got to Australia from a very cold February day in England, walked over from the Noalimba hostel to Murdoch, saw the only kangaroos I've ever seen loose in the wild in an urban area, and rang the one name, which was Maureen Smith. And she said, contact Grant Stone.
She's an academic.
Yes.
Wasn't it? Still is.
And Grant said, there's a West Australian Science Fiction Association, and they have a meeting in Hertha Road just opposite the tip.
Great place.
So I went along, and when Laurie Martin stepped down as president, I thought that it was time to volunteer, and I volunteered to be president. And I don't actually remember very much happening while I was president, to be honest.
I do.
Except for SwanCon 2 being organised, by which time I had stepped down to being treasurer.
Right. Can you remember the WASFA News formation and reflections? Were they things you were involved in?
Oh, yes. David Underwood, who I was married to at that time, edited them.
Right. So they happened in your lounge room, more or less?
Yes.
This raising of the eyebrows and saying yes is very common in fandom, especially when one looks back on past projects. Thank God they're over, aren't they? Aren't we happy those days are now behind us? But
as I recall, we didn't have access to much in the way of reproduction equipment, and we ended up having to photocopy them at Murdoch. I think it
Possibly. Yes, they
was
were,
Murdoch.
because that's why they're so terrible. I mean, the photocopiers have got better, but at this stage we were using at Murdoch. No, they're brilliant now. The staff machines are clean and always working. The student machines are always breaking down and throwing out cards. But look, you guys do it to yourselves.
And they were typed on a manual typewriter. We didn't have computers in those days.
No, I
I
think
don't think there was anybody in WASFA who had a word processing computer.
David must have had some sort of spiralograph thing too, because they had all these weird
Yes.
pen drawings
He did.
that sort of look like you've just had one of those funny things. Some sort of pen drawing. But I'm sure they were done in full consciousness. Sally, look, also thinking about those days of WASFA, was WASFA growing? I mean, was it a viable organisation? Or were we already starting to have fights?
It wasn't growing until SwanCon 2. A lot of people came to SwanCon 2. I think it was about 100 people. We had it at the Belmont Community Hall, and this great influx of people came into the measly little WASFA, which had about 10 members turning up to any given meeting. I think it may have had more members than that, but it had about 10 people at any given meeting. This enormous influx of people came along. In fact, that was when Ian Nichols first came into fandom in
Right.
Western Australia, and Mark Coloney and a number of other people.
Right.
And WASFA took off in energy and enthusiasm and things actually happening at that point.
Right.
So it certainly wasn't dying then. In fact, that was really when it got an injection of energy.
Thanks, Sally. When Sally says it got an injection of energy, do you know about trilobites? I mean, I don't, but I'm going to use them as a metaphor. So if you're a geologist, just bear with the metaphor. You can look in the geological record, and you can see all this activity of the massive biota in dead trilobites stuck in the rocks. You know, sort of say this was a really good 3 million years here. We've got zentillion trilobites. Oh look, they had a lean time here. Must have been hit by a meteorite. There's not many trilobites, and this sort of goes on for a while. You just look at the massive trilobites. Well, in science fiction fandom, you do it with fanzines. You say, hey, here was a good year. They had 27 fanzines happening in Western Australia. They must have had a fight here. Now they've got 7 Star Trek magazines over here, and they've got 2 Doctor Who magazines here, and they've still got 6 million fanzines in the middle about science fiction fandom. Well, that late period in the 1970s was the blossoming period in Western Australia for fanzines. When Larry says when Bob said he thought the first one produced was Felder, there was a fanzine in the 70s called Omega, which was a fanzine produced out of a high school. And if you want to find out about it, ask Anthony Pesce, because Anthony had something to do with the formation, that he was teaching in the school, and it was a kids' production that was sold within the school. It does turn up occasionally at auctions. It lasted about 9 issues, contained a lot of good fiction. One of the guys editing is a guy called Greg Egan, who's now a published author and lives in the eastern states and is still writing and still being published. That was Western Australian fandom. But the fanzines that came out of fandom sort of start with Felder, more or less, and the ones that were coming out of the club situation, but they take off after SwanCon 2, and there's a whole host of fanzines. Anthony, would you like to give us the name of your fanzine for a little while?
For a little while, it was called Clockwork Radish.
Clockwork Radish. Nice title. There was the Bionic Rabbit. Now, some of you may well remember the Bionic Rabbit. Damien was not a character you could miss within WA fandom. He was quite tall and quite orange. I always thought that was the reason why he had rabbits in his fanzines, because he looked like a carrot. I run him down. Didn't he do something within the Society for Creative Anachronism stuff? Didn't he? Isn't he king of the whole universe by force of arms or something?
He's the ex-prince as of now.
Ex-prince, someone's beaten him up. Oh. Anyway, Damien went to the east, but for a while he was involved in fandom here, and his fanzine created quite a sensation. Rob McGough had a cartoon in it, which I can remember. Can you remember the title? That was a rhetorical question. As you see, Fanish history just goes on. It's a never-ending and always amusing subject for conversation, debate, and sometimes just trying to set the record straight. I trust that what we were doing at SwanCon 13 turns its way into a full-blown workshop over 4 or 5 days at the National Science Fiction Convention for Australia, Conviction, which is happening in June in Sydney. We remain to see if we can put the money together and the resources together to make that happen. We hope so. Next week on the show, as I promised you, we'll look at Rotten Reviews, a literary companion, as well as some of the best and newest of science fiction and fantasy available for the Perth community. That's until next week, when again I hope I have your ears. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Faster Than Light radio show, produced and recorded in the audio studios of Murdoch University for 6UBS FM.